First of all, it's 2 p.m. Grandpa's definitely into the rum at that point. But
Yeah, bedtime's 4:30, dude.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of 1001 Album Complaints. This is the podcast where lifelong friends, musicians, and guys who have come to define their personality by what they don't like get together to talk about music from Robert Dimery's list of 1001 albums you must hear before you die. Now, we are going to give some deep dives on this artist, talk about the recording of the album, get into some specific tracks so that you know exactly what we're talking about, and at the end, we are going to vote and tell you whether or not this album really does belong on a list of 1001 albums you must hear before you die. Now, a quick word of caution. If this is your first time listening to the show, we are going to make fun of this band. We're going to make fun of this album. I know they're a bunch of sweet old grandpas, but we are going to rip into these guys because while we are music fans ourselves and we love music, we appreciate art in its truest form, we do also understand that there is a lot to make fun of and to nitpick. So with that being said, this week we are diving in to the September 16th, 1997 release by Buena Vista Social Club. The album is self-titled because Buena Vista Social Club was not really a band before this. We're going to get into that. But to give you an idea of what we've been listening to this week, we are going to play a clip from the opening track on the album, which has become somewhat of a signature song for this project. It is the song Chan Chan.
De Alto Cedro voy para Marcané, llego a Puerto voy para Mayarín. De Alto Cedro voy para Marcané, llego a Puerto voy para Mayarín. De Alto Cedro voy para Marcané, llego a Puerto voy para Mayarín. Que te tengo, no te lo puedo negar. Se me sale la babita, yo no lo puedo evitar.
All right, now that we have level set, I am going to throw it around the room to our cast of complainers who are going to give their introduction by way of a particularly mean tweet-length review. And I'm going to go first to Rob.
thanks so much, Tom. Excited to get into it this week. Here's my tweet-length review of Buena Vista Social Club. I'm transported. I feel cool. I'm swept away by the untouchable, sepia-toned romance of it all. And then I get bored and wonder how soon I can step away without seeming rude or like I don't support non-white things.
Ooh. All right. Next, we are going to throw it over to Marty.
What's up, freaks? Here's my not so mean, but maybe a little snarky tweet-length review. Ry Cooder sounds like a minor character in a Star Wars movie that you'd find humbly sitting in his favorite cantina, blaster in one hand, blue plasma beverage in the other, listening to his favorite alien Cuban orchestra, Buena Vista Social Club.
Do you know what the genre of music that the band in the cantina in Star Wars was playing is called? What George Lucas called that genre of music? Do you know what that is, Marty?
I don't know. Dog shit? I don't know.
He called it jizz.
Jizz.
Not jazz.
Okay.
It's jizz.
Yeah, well,
Because it's space jazz.
Yeah,
so
that's
it's-
right.
It's got to be different.
Man, big swing and miss on that one, George. Way to prove that editors make the final product. All right. We're going to throw it on over to Phil. Phil, what is your mean tweet?
Roast pork, ham, Swiss cheese, pickles, mustard. That's what I thought a Cuban was until about 1999 or 2000 when I first heard this record. And I think Buena Vista Social Club has, flavor that even a vegan can enjoy.
That was not particularly mean, Phil. You're really holding back. I know they're senior citizens, but I think they can take it. All right. And my name is Tom. I'm going to be taking us on the stroll through the barrio that is the background of Buena Vista Social Club. And my tweet length review is just come get your abuela Cuba. He's drunk and won't stop hitting on 25-year-olds. Let's segue in to our general impressions of this album. I think we were all relatively familiar with it, but let me know, how was your week?
I'll jump off by saying that, yeah, I had listened to this around the time it came out. As I'm sure we're going to talk about in the story, it was somewhat of a worldwide phenomenon, to my understanding. It was everywhere. And yet it also felt cool to listen to when we were around 20 years old. It has a great vibe, so I definitely enjoyed being in that world. I have to admit, and I'm sure we're going to prove to the ethnomusicologists in our audience that we're not fully equipped to take in what the meaning of this is. There's some ideas here that I would love to discuss with you guys that are not central to, but kind of sitting next to the music. Like the insularity of American cultural tastes, or this idea of like standards around the world, that each culture has its own set of standards going back possibly 100 years or more. And it can be really easy to forget that. So ultimately, it's a nice reminder of the rich tradition of music outside of the US. That said, am I truly equipped to appreciate it? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'll pick up kind of what you laid down, Rob, in that this album is, if you think about like something like the Folkways compilations where you had, Alan Lomax, whatever that guy's name was, that would travel around the country, the US, and put together these unrecorded or unknown pieces of music into a package. This is kind of what that is. It's just benefits from the modern ability to record music easily and cheaply. And so, yeah, this plays to me as kind of like, someone's kind of pet project to compile a history of music from Cuba. And that's kind of what you get here.
And that's a very noble undertaking for the record. It's just not quite the same as being able to say definitively that this is the best representation of these songs or even these musical styles.
Definitely not, but what it does do is it feels consistent. It feels like these people, even though I'm not sure, and maybe we'll learn if all the people that contributed, the 21 musicians that are on this album, knew each other's music, were friends, were best buddies, were childhood friends or whatever.
I think it's a mix. I think we're going to learn about that, and it's a mix of...
That's what I was going to say, is that it feels cohesive. The recording feels like from one song to the next, you could tell they were in the same room. It doesn't feel like a compilation in that way.
And it always feels like a live band, and it always feels like they're having a good time. There is an air of relaxation, but also fun.
Well, Rob, you sort of alluded to this in your comment about every culture having their own standards, right? Standard songs. And in this case, I think it's also particularly interesting, and we'll get into this a little as we talk about like the history of it, but these guys, the whole culture was totally isolated from the Western world. So in addition to everything we just talked about, like they didn't hear Elvis or Buddy Holly or the Beatles. Like that shit just didn't make it to Cuba in a meaningful way. They talk in the documentary about how the musicians like didn't know who Marilyn Monroe was or they didn't recognize when they came to the US. They didn't recognize John F. Kennedy or Richard Nixon by their photos because those images had not meaningfully made it to Cuba. It's crazy.
Yeah, you can tell what's been let in. What's been let in from the outside.
Yeah, and it's not much.
But I think the somewhat of a counterpoint to that is that I was also reading that this was not popular within Cuba.
That makes sense.
Like it made it to the rest of the world. And it's because that some Cubans feel like it is a sort of imperialist nostalgia trip, right? That it implies that Cuban music has not been continuing to evolve for the last 70 years or whatever it might have been, which is simply not true.
That's very fair.
One of the things that I think is central to this album and the joy that comes off in this album is that these guys had been left behind by their own musical scene because of a lot of different factors, but basically music passed them by, and their chance to really be a part of a vibrant music scene was kind of dashed by political factors. Mm-hmm. And then when music came back, it wasn't this kind of music. And it was incorporating more stuff from the outside world, and nobody wanted to hear these old guys. And so when they got this opportunity, they were like, literally nobody has given a shit about my music for 40 years. And finally, somebody comes and says, I want to play your music. And then it turns into this, which is just not only a great product, but Rob, you're right, a cultural phenomenon. It really caught on in a way that even 20-something grungster fish fans, guys who listen to prog rock, were playing this at house parties and stuff because it just has a cool vibe to it.
Right, but I guess what culture, I guess, is the phenomenon in question.
Well, there's also a little bit of this kind of nostalgia for the simplicity that, for me, I think helped me to appreciate this album a little bit more, because these songs are really not that complicated in terms of their construction, and there's just a beauty to how straightforward and simple a lot of these are.
Yeah, it's very humble.
Yeah.
And the musicians are all very good, but they all play very quietly.
They do.
And they leave a lot of room for each other. You
Yeah.
know, it's very easy to listen to.
A lot of minimalism.
There's a lot of percussion, but no drum set. You know.
Yeah. A lot of texture on this album. It's got great texture, and there's great patience with the musicians. You know, you dig into these individual elements, and each person is not doing a whole lot. But when you got 20 guys, they can't all be doing a whole lot. That just turns into chaos. And so they all sort of knew, coming up in this tradition that they had originally played in, which was, you know, free-flowing, but also involved a lot of different members, they would know how to pick their spots. And these guys really did deploy that to great effect. One of the things that I was thinking about when I was listening to this album, because, you know, generally speaking, I really like this album, but it's really mood music. And I settled on this is evening music. This is not morning music. This isn't afternoon music even. This isn't evening music. This is meant to be listened to in like a room with all the windows open on a perfect summer night when you have like your shirt unbuttoned and the air feels like it's, you know, skin temperature. It's just, that's exactly what you're supposed to be doing while listening to this album. On like Monday morning when I'm driving my kids to school and I'm playing this, they're like, what the fuck are you playing this for, Dad? That, like, we're not.
It is very odd driving music.
Yeah.
Listening to it while driving a car on the highway doesn't quite feel right. I agree with that.
It's also weird that it's also kind of island music. I just got back from Hawaii, and a lot of the music they play there has this kind of laid back island vibe. And Cuba's kind of like centered near, like, you know, the Jamaica. And
We know what islands are. Yeah, we.
You're right. There is a shared island music kind of culture, and it must have something to do with emphasizing upbeats.
Right, like the 2 and the 4. Yeah.
It just feels more light and airy than so-called Western music, can be very on the beat.
I also feel like, first of all, my wife, born and raised in Hawaii, and every time I go there, I'm like, you people have no concept of time. You don't ever get anywhere on time. It's just, they're on island time the whole time. And I think that comes across in the music. Like you said, they're not rigidly on the beat. They're kind of behind or a little bit ahead, and they're kind of just playing around with it. I also think that, especially for Cuba, there was not a culture of like economic achievement and that pressure on them. And so I think even the subject matter of the songs is less about, I'm dissatisfied with life because I haven't achieved as much as I want to achieve. And it's a little bit more like, I'm appreciating what's around me, and there's this beautiful nature.
It's relaxed. We were talking about this when we were in Hawaii, about like those like survivor shows where you get like dropped off in like the, you know, middle of Alaska with like nothing but like a stick, and you have to like survive. If you were to get dropped off in like Hawaii, you'd come out like overweight. It's just like abundant with like everything good, food, water.
Yeah. And let's jump into a little bit about Buena Vista Social Club. Now, the Buena Vista Social Club album, as we said, it was a phenomenon in the late 90s. It was pretty much inescapable. It became one of the best-selling, quote-unquote, world albums of all time, which I guess, as far as Americans are concerned, world albums is just anything that's not from the UK or the US, basically.
Yeah, that's a dumb name, but that's what people call it. So I think we're just going to go with that.
It's a dumb name. Yeah, we're just going to have to go with it.
I always think Enya, which would be like a world that we don't live in.
Yes.
I guess.
Yeah, it's like fantasy music.
Right.
Yeah. But seriously, though, it ends up selling over 8 million copies around the globe, penetrated into segments of the population that you would not otherwise expect to be fans of this type of music. It's not just a hit with the abuelos of the world. Like, you'd hear it in restaurants, bars, taxis, house parties. It was everywhere. It is a towering achievement of Afro-Cuban music. And to truly tell the background of how this came together, we unfortunately have to start the story with a white guy from the UK.
Of course.
This is a guy named Nick Gold. Nick Gold is a record producer and the owner of the label World Circuit, which produced and released this album. Now, World Circuit was a label that was created in the 80s, basically because this other organization called Arts Worldwide, which was a concert tour management company that specialized in bringing Latin American and African acts to play in the UK, realized that when they would put on these shows, people would be like, oh, that's great. Can I buy these guys' albums? And they'd be like, no. They don't really have an album, they don't have distribution. So they set up a label specifically to promote the acts that they were bringing on tour so that they could sell albums at the shows that they were putting on. And Nick graduates from college with a degree in African Studies, and he goes to work for Arts Worldwide and World Circuit, and he is scouting talent. And then he works there for a bit, and in the 90s, I think it's like the mid-90s, not a ton of information on this, but in the mid-90s, he decides that he wants to buy the label. He ends up buying it, takes it over, and he has a concept for an album that he wants to put together. And remember, he has an African Studies degree. He wants to put together Malian musicians and Cuban musicians. He wants to put together a recording session in Havana for these musicians from Mali and musicians from Cuba. And he solicits the help of Ry Cooder for the project. And Marty, you already mentioned Ry Cooder in your tweet-length review. It sounds like what a 18th century London prostitute would catch.
For sure. That was a good. I wondered how that joke would play out, and that was better than I would have expected.
I started there, but it was too cheap, so I went the Star Wars route.
I'm not above any crude jokes, Marty, as I think fans of the show can tell.
You're probably going to touch on it, Tom, but I read that it's not like the African musicians, the Malian musicians, and Cuban musicians. It wasn't just a random, let's pair two random things together and see what happens. There was already some cross-pollination musically going on there, right?
Yeah, definitely. And in fact, one of the things that we're going to get into is there is the musical genre that is particularly Cuban called son cubano. That is like a specific musical subgenre of Cuban music, and that is what these guys are playing, son cubana. It is a musical genre that's a mixture of Hispanic and African elements. So the African elements you get, it's mostly in the percussion. There's a heavy use of what they call the son clave, which is again like the Cuban version of the clave, which is, you know, we talked about the clave before. It's not 1, 2, 3, 4. The son clave is 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. You know, that kind of 1, 2 cha-cha-cha feel. That's the son clave. And they use a lot of percussion, like bongos, maracas, and a lot of call and response in their music. That's sort of what defines the African side of the son clave.
You know, that son clave comment, I think maybe even, it's just like another shred of evidence towards Rob's comment about like each culture maybe having their own songbook, right? It makes me think of things like, I mean, I think of it as the Bo Diddley rhythm, but it's definitely just like that classic rhythm and blues rhythm. And then there's all of that like Indian stuff, right? That's in 7.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I could have done some homework, you know, to give you some info on that. But like the McLaughlin record, Shakti's all about it.
Sure. Well, when you think about it, for the non-musical nerds in the audience, what we're really talking about is breaking up a measure of music into subdivisions and, say, eighth notes. So there's 8 of them. You only have so many choices for how to layer a rhythm over that. It is finite, but there are a lot of variations, and that's where you get these different rhythmic ideas around the world.
Yeah. And so that rhythmic element, which did come from Africa, because Cuba is a very racially integrated country, not necessarily in terms of like socially, racially integrated, but there was a lot of Africans that were brought over from the slave trade to the Caribbean during the, 1600s, 1700s. And so there was a lot of that African influence on Cuba. And obviously the other influence is the Spanish influence. And so from the Spanish side, you get the singing style, primarily a Spanish influenced singing style in terms of their lyric and the lyrical meter that they use. And the guitar style is a primarily Spanish guitar style, but is primarily played on something called the tres guitar, which I had to look up because I was like, I don't know what a tres guitar is, but it is a variant of a guitar. It's actually Cuba's national instrument. And I'm just going right from Wikipedia here. A tres is described as a 3-course chordophone. And so chordophone is basically just a guitar that you chord things on. But the fact that it is 3-coursed means that there are 3 sets of strings, and those sets of strings are closer together. They're not all equidistant on the neck, unlike the fretboard of the guitar. So they're 3 sets of strings that are all close together. Mm-hmm. The bottom 2 strings are tuned in an octave from each other, and then the top 2 sets of strings are tuned to the same note. And so it gives this like interesting feel to the guitar that is not traditionally thought of when you think of a traditional Western tuning of a guitar, where you have, an octave on top, octave on bottom.
Even the instrument you're describing is like a weird, and it sounds like this. It sounds like an interesting hybridization of like what we think of as a mandolin, right? Because you have these doubled strings, or these like stacked strings, almost like a 12-string guitar. But it's definitely the scale, many, many other things about the guitar, not similar to a Western Martin acoustic guitar.
Yeah, and I honestly, like a lot of guitar players, when they pick up a mandolin, will just have no idea how to play it because it's tuned in fifths and not in fourths. And they're like, none of the hand configurations that I'm used to work on this. And so the tres is kind of like that. It's somewhat similar, Marty, to your point. It's kind of similar to the ukulele in a way, because it is also sort of tuned to make a lot of open tuning sound good. So you don't even have to press anything. You just hit the chords. It sounds good. It's a lot of, you can just put one finger and it'll make this thing sound completely different, but everything still kind of sounds harmonious. It's an interesting take on a guitar. And so that is all this stuff that sort of goes into this amalgamation of different sounds, Spanish, African, and then goes into this melting pot of Cuba and becomes this son cubano, which is the style of music that they end up playing on this album.
If you look at the instruments that Ry Cooder plays on this album, there's some weird ones on there. The mbira, the oud, the bolon, the floor slide. There's like all these.
Well, the oud is another stringed instrument, kind of cousin of the guitar, that's popular in Middle Eastern music. I know that.
Almost kind of looks like a lute, Like I think all these things kind of evolved from the lute back in the day. But
So I'll just even dive into it right now, and this is just like a guitar player thing, right? Ry Cooder is credited, for lack of a better word, with popularizing some open guitar tunings for slide guitar. There's basic, like, Ry Cooder. The story goes, Ry Cooder was hired as a session musician by the Stones somewhere in the 60s, taught Keith Richards a whole bunch of these open tunings for slide. Keith loved them. They became friends. At some point, Ry Cooder says, "Hey, you stole all my licks," and they stopped being friends. But like a lot of those classic Stones riffs, those like Sticky Fingers riffs specifically, the guitar is tuned D, G, D, G, B, D, like an open G chord, which is a Ry Cooder tuning, which is like...
You're saying Keith got his signature tuning from Ry Cooder.
Yeah, he took the Ry Cooder open G slide tuning and he just took the low end off of the instrument. And what's particularly interesting about that, when I'm looking here at like the tres and some of these other instruments, is that they're also tuned into these open chords. So again, it's just this like openness and this like ringingness of the sound.
Well, and I think openness is probably a pretty good descriptor for Ry Cooder generally, because he does seem like he was very open to lots of different kinds of music. When he gets tapped by Nick Gold to get involved in this project, you know, he's a guy. Like, Ry Cooder is not just some random dude who fell ass backwards into this and that was his most successful thing.
Oh,
Like,
yeah.
he played with John Lee Hooker, he played with Neil Young, Gordon Lightfoot, the Doobie Brothers. Like, he played with a bunch of different guys. But he said,
And had hits himself.
yeah, exactly. He was a total dude.
Pretty sure he's on some Beefheart records.
Captain Beefheart, yeah.
Oh, totally. He's a presence. I read an interview with him where he talks about just like devouring music from like age 10 and playing at age 13, playing 8 hours of guitar a day. Like he knows what's up.
I think that's one of the other cool parts of the story, because we're going to learn for the Cuban musicians, it was about bringing them into prominence long after they had been cast aside to a certain extent by the culture. But in a way, Ry Cooder is getting that moment too, because he's this prolific session musician who had been behind the scenes on so many records, but wasn't really a household name.
Sure. And I would argue he's not still a household name, but, you know, he certainly got his laurels with this one.
That name in particular is going to be difficult to make a household name. It doesn't really have.
Ry Cooder. Yeah.
Definitely sounds like an infection.
So apparently, though, when he was approached about this project, he was like, I actually have a bunch of tapes from the 50s of old Cuban music that I loved from when I was younger. And I used to play that shit all the time. So he was like totally 100% down for the project, really appreciated the musical heritage of Cuba and knew kind of what he was getting into.
Classic Cooder.
Classic Cooter. Exactly. So they are about to go into the studio. They have this plan where they're going to get these guys from Mali to come and they're going to bring them to Havana and they're going to have a whole bunch of Cuban musicians play with them. And all of a sudden, it turns out that the Malian musicians cannot get their passports and visas in order and they cannot make it. And so they're left scrambling a little bit to get this project together. But you know what? They say, we're still going to go to Cuba. We're still going to make an album. We're just going to do it with only Cuban musicians. And so they have to get a band together relatively quickly. And they recruit this guy, Juan de Marcos Gonzalez, who was kind of a well-known Cuban band leader. And Juan is in his mid-40s at the time. So he's not like a spring chicken or anything like that. But they ask him to put together a band for this project. Juan goes out and recruits musicians that he knew from the scene and looked up to from listening to music in his youth, which was the 50s and 60s. And like from the sound of it, Nick and Ry Cooder were not expecting him to bring in a bunch of guys who had their heyday before color TV was even a thing. But they were sort of just like, yeah, you know what? It works. We're going to make it.
Yeah, these dudes are like pushing 80, right?
Well,
Yeah.
that is actually going to lead us into our favorite segment on the podcast. Rob, thanks for the segue. It is by the numbers. So, first number we're going to throw out is 20. That is the number of musicians that appear on this album. I have seen 21 other places, but I am going to go with the number 20. It's a nice round number. I think that's a good number. 20 musicians on this album. Like, even when you sell 8 million copies, if you're cutting that shit up 20 ways, it can't be a lot of money. The next number I'm going to throw out there is 89. And that was the age of Campe Segundo when this album was recorded. He was the oldest person in the project. And frankly, how could he not be?
It's that Cuban healthcare system you hear about. You know?
It's drinking rum in the afternoon, obviously.
That's what I'm saying. They weren't teetotalers. These guys were like drinking rum and smoking cigars and like, this is fucking great. I love this. So the next number that we're going to throw out there is 25,000. As in, Ry Cooder was fined $25,000 by the United States government for violating the Trading with the Enemy Act,
Jeez.
which was put into place as an act of Congress that forbade doing any business with Cuba. I'm pretty sure it is maybe still in place. Like, we've just been shitting on Cuba ever since they had the audacity to become communist.
That's terrible.
I hope someone's listening to this years from now when it's not a factor anymore. But Ry Cooder probably had to go through Mexico or something to even get to Cuba.
He flew through Mexico to get to Cuba, yeah. And then when he came back, they were like, you were doing what? And he was like, yeah, I got fined $25,000, sold 8 million copies.
Yeah, I'm sure 25,000. Yeah, it was just like it was pocket change, you know.
And weirdly, this is a tidbit I heard not too long ago, that it's not about visiting the country of Cuba for Americans. It is about spending money there.
Yeah. Yeah, you're not allowed to help the Cuban economy. We're trying to starve them into submission, and here we are, like 60 years later? It
Yeah, I
hasn't
was gonna
worked.
say.
We might want to give up on that one.
And still operating a prison there.
Yeah, right.
Insane.
Exactly. Well, that's probably a factor. They're like, listen, if we don't have to have formal relations with the Cuban government, we can do whatever we want in Guantanamo Bay, and it doesn't really matter. Who's going to say anything about it?
Well, speaking of which, maybe this is later in your story, but I think I read that Ibrahim Ferrer also couldn't come accept his Grammy because of visa issues. I think he got a Grammy for a later release or something.
Yeah, there was definitely a lot of issues with them getting outside of Cuba to the Western world, but we'll touch on that a little bit later, because the last number that we're going to throw out there is the number 11. And that is the number of countries where Buena Vista Social Club went platinum. It went platinum in 11 countries, and double and triple platinum in many of those countries as well. Like I said, sold over 8 million copies worldwide. And for a bunch of dudes, again, one of these guys was 89 years old when this album was recorded. How good must that have felt? Even your grandkids don't want to hear the music that you're playing, and then all of a sudden it's the coolest thing in the fucking world.
You're like, well, I'm gonna be playing, Carnegie Hall next month. So
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I wonder what the groupie situation was like for these guys.
That has to be some kind of record of albums that go platinum in that many countries. That can't be common, right?
I mean, you're up in like Madonna and Michael Jackson territory there, like
Right.
that's pretty rarefied air.
Oh, I mean, especially like Spanish language albums.
yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, or just non-English albums, generally speaking. Yeah,
And just kind of clicking through, like the people that played on this that have died all lived well into their 90s.
yeah. They have
Which is
that joie de vivre, man. It goes a long way. It keeps you young. All right, so let's get back to the story here. They have Juan DeMarcos Gonzalez. He's a band leader. He recruits guys who were big on the Cuban music scene in the 1950s. And by and large, most of them hadn't really been working musicians in any like serious capacity for several decades. And one of the reasons why is what we've kind of danced around here before, and that is the Cuban Revolution that happens in 1959. And with that, the government shut down most of the nightclubs in the country. Now, there were a lot of reasons behind that, one of which is that many of the nightclubs had ties to the American mafia. But one of the venues that was closed down was a famous Havana club, sort of, called the Buena Vista Social Club. And social clubs were a big thing before the Cuban Revolution. These were members-only clubs that were often oriented around a certain profession. So there would be a cigar rollers social club. There'd be a social club for doctors, for engineers, for other professionals. The Buena Vista Social Club was the club for musicians in Havana. And they would put on performances there. And also the guys would just be playing around on the nightclub scene in general. Now, social clubs were racially segregated. And you would have white social clubs and black social clubs. And the Buena Vista Social Club was a black social club. Now, that didn't mean that every member there was of African descent. It more meant that the white social clubs had no members that were of African descent. So it was a little bit more of an integrated club. But as the government in Cuba moved more and more in this sort of leftist position post-revolution, one of the things that they were trying to achieve was a classless society where everyone was equal and racial differences were de-emphasized. Not an inherently bad goal, right?
Not at all. No.
Yeah. However, there's always a however with that stuff. Like many things in life, there's a big gap between the lofty goal and the real world execution. And a lot of the black social clubs were celebrating the different heritages of their members. And they were celebrating the differences, and the government thought that was counter-revolutionary. And so they shut down a lot of these social clubs, and the Buena Vista Social Club gets shut down. So the Buena Vista Social Club is shut down, a lot of the nightclubs are shut down, and the music scene just kind of dies. For about like 10 years, there's kind of no Havana music scene. And so you have all these dudes that were like in their prime, cock of the walk, performing nightly, for lots of adoring fans. And it really kind of gets taken away overnight. And from the sound of it, they were really super bummed about it. They went about their lives and they played music, but they were still craving that experience. One of the guys...
There was nowhere to play music, is ultimately what you're saying.
There was nowhere to play music for a period of time. Now...
Little did they know it, the 60s were happening in the rest of the world.
So they kind of knew it. Like, it wasn't that they were in a complete and total bubble, but...
Right, they all pop up on stuff during that period before this album was released.
Yeah, they pop up on stuff. So it's not like they were like completely in a bubble, but like these guys were like big presences in a pretty vibrant music scene. And then that vibrant music scene gets killed. And then their ability to go outside and do other stuff also is taken away because their passport can't get them anywhere and they can't go to the United States and stuff like that. So from the sound of it, they were like really jonesing for this opportunity. They just loved to play music. The Ruben Gonzalez, who was a piano player on there, apparently like he was in his mid 70s when they recorded this. And they said he would be there waiting at the door when they would go into the studio in the morning time. And he would just sit down and play the piano until they kicked him out at the end of the night. He's like, all I want to do is play the fucking piano. Just please let me play the piano.
Because I read that he hadn't owned his own piano in like years.
Yeah, he didn't have any money. These guys were not like, oh, well, I'm going to take all that earnings from my... They had nothing. The entire economy of Cuba got completely destroyed.
Right.
I saw an anecdote about the keys player and just like a snippet of a documentary or an interview I watched. I think it was the Charlie Rose interview, where they said when they found him originally, they were concerned that he wasn't going to be able to play because of arthritis. But it had just turned out he had just not been playing because he didn't own a piano. Like, he was fine.
Yeah, he's like, I'm just a little rusty.
He just needed to like play a piano for a week. He was just rusty. Yeah.
So the music scene in Cuba gets completely destroyed in the late 50s. And then it kind of starts to come back to life in the late 60s. But when it comes back, the musical taste has kind of moved away from the style of music that these guys were playing and that you hear on this album. And it was more towards music that was influenced by the outside world. So they were incorporating funk, jazz, and rock and roll. And so to many people in Cuba, especially the young people, this Cuban Son was like powerfully uncool. And like Rob, you said, also kind of seen as like you're looking back to a time where we were essentially an economic fiefdom of the United States. And now we're like, you know, Cuba, and we're standing on our own. And we want to make music that is modern and not looking back towards this time in our history that we're not super proud of. So yeah, it's like uncool grandpa music, which I thought was kind of ironic because then it becomes uber cool grandpa music like 30 years later.
It sort of makes sense, right? Think of it as folk music, right? And then think about like early solo Dylan and how lame that would sound in like 1977 if you were into Foghat, you know, and like the way you got into rock and roll was Foghat. Or Led Zeppelin.
I think what's kind of interesting, though, what you're alluding to of the phenomenon of it is that it crossed a lot of demographic barriers, at least in the United States, where we were experiencing it. I feel like we thought it was cool, but also they probably at some point were playing it at Starbucks. And usually those two things don't meet up.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I want to know why it was on the Belgian charts from 2015 to 2021 every single year. Like, what happened? What happened there?
I don't know, man. The Belgians just got hip to it. Maybe there was a dance craze that was going on because it's very danceable music. You know, I could definitely see the appeal of being 23 in Havana in 1954 and like going out to a nightclub and just sashaying with a bunch of beautiful women in sundresses because it's all hot and sweaty outside. That sounds pretty amazing, I gotta say.
Right. Yeah, it has that kind of universal. I mean, almost any aged person could listen to this and appreciate it, which I think helps it with chart stuff.
Absolutely. All right, so we're going to get back to 1996. Juan DeMarcos Gonzalez has been charged with putting this band together, and he recruits these guys that all play this older, sort of more traditional son cubano type of music. The guys that he gets to sign on were Orlando Chachito Lopez, who plays bass on the album, Eliades Ochoa, who is a cigar-smoking 51-year-old Cuban trace guitar player and singer. described by none other than Benicio del Toro as the Cuban Johnny Cash. He's actually the singer on 4 of the songs, including the few that we're going to touch on, and he plays guitar on 5 of the tracks. And lastly, Manuel Lucia was tapped to sing on the album. And Ry Cooder's son, Joaquim, who was only 19 at the time, but is studying Latin percussion, was brought on to play drums. So they get a space at a studio in Havana called EGREM Studio, which had been a big place to record in like the 1950s, but it had fallen out of favor. And because it had fallen out of favor, it wasn't that it wasn't ever used or untouched, but it still had the same room and the same equipment from the 1950s that had sat there basically since the Cuban Revolution. They hadn't really upgraded a lot of it. And that's something that is uniquely Cuban. They say you go down there and you see these like 1950s American cars, and they're like beautifully restored because they don't get a whole lot of new stuff. So they have to just fix the shit that they have and make it last forever. So they get together in March of 1996, and over the course of 6 days, they record this entire album. Now, this was, by all accounts, a very free-flowing session. You will notice that I've only mentioned 3 Cuban musicians that they signed up for the project, but it sounds like they kind of just all brought along their buddies. Like, there's a story where Nick Gold said they were recording a vocal take, and he was like, it was for Dos Gardenias, and he's like, I don't know if I'm happy with the vocal take for this. And one of the just like 70-plus-year-old dudes is just like, I got it. I'll be back in an hour. And just leaves and comes back with his friends. And it's Ibrahim Farrar that he brings back. And Ibrahim Farrar sings it and crushes it. And it was like, you should just stick around for the rest of the session. Just sing on every other song. And he's like, yeah, that sounds fucking great. And he just, proceeds to not only sing on a bunch of stuff, he provides a song that they do. Like, it sounds like very fun.
Could you imagine that? Just like you're recording, you're like, that drum take's not going well. You're like, hold on. Gonna go pick up my boy.
Yep.
He's gonna knock this right out.
Like, think about Ibrahim Farrar. He's probably like sitting at a cafe, like sipping on a coffee at 2:00 in the afternoon, and somebody comes up and he's like, "Hey, you want to come and sing? I got this thing down the street. You want to come and sing?" And then it literally changes the course of his life.
Right. First of all, it's 2 p.m. Grandpa's definitely into the rum at that point. But
Yeah, bedtime's 4:30, dude.
I heard he was a shoe shiner and lottery ticket salesman. That was like his job at the time.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, they had no money. He's like, I'm a singer. That's what I'm good at. Nobody wants to hear what I do.
But that's also the really cool part about it being this collection of songs that are part of this shared culture of all of them. That so many people know the material and then can add their take to it.
Yeah, like Dos Gardenias wasn't a traditional, but it was a standard. Like, I think it was from the 40s. So he had performed it a whole bunch when he had his heyday back in the 50s. And was intimately familiar with it, and came in and gave, we'll talk about it later, but I think it's just a fantastic performance on that. So that's how this sort of project ended up ballooning into all of these musicians being involved in it, because it really does sound like they were all just like, not taking it seriously. It's wrong to say they weren't taking it seriously, but it sounds like they were like, let's extract as much fun out of this experience that we can, because some dude from the UK came and brought this US musician with some money, and they booked us a studio for 6 days. Like, let's just have a fucking great time.
Is that what happened? You might not know this. I mean, was it like, hey, do you want to get paid to come record music, or was it more involved than that?
I frankly have no idea what the contractual situation was, but the vibe that I get from all of the interviews is that they kind of were just like, this sounds like a great time. Let's go do this.
Right. They're like, have you heard the album Graceland by Paul Simon?
Yeah. We're going to do kind of the same thing, except for we're not going to have a white guy sing.
Right. I'm just trying to picture us 40 years from now getting tapped on the shoulder to go hang out with all of us together just in some studio singing songs from the 90s.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
dude, if somebody taps you, Rob, and it's like, hey, I want you to put together a album of traditional Weezer tunes, I would hope that you're going to give me a call to show up to that session.
You guys will be the first call, yeah.
We sourced the last piano in the U.S.
So, as I said before, the recording was done in a studio that was built in the 50s, and it didn't have a ton of acts recording there post-revolution, but, it was still in use. But apparently Ry Cooder, falls in love with the room. And so his whole thing is ambient natural sound. And so nothing is close mic'd. And apparently that got away from the tradition that a lot of Cuban recording studios had been using. Even that studio, they had been close micing everything. And he was like, you have this beautiful big wooden room. Everything is going to be room mics. Everything is going to be ambient. And so a lot of the band takes were all at one time, everybody in a room, and they're just, putting a couple of mics out. A lot of the vocal takes would just have they often would record the vocals separately from the band. Sometimes they recorded with the band, but they would have the backing vocals and the main vocals kind of all recorded at the same time. Mm-hmm. And you can tell, because it does sound very in the room. Mm-hmm. I think it's like a beautifully recorded album.
It does have like a Phil Spector wall of sound. Sounds a bit like a live record as well. I don't think I would have picked up, right, that it's all sort of like it's being recorded like an orchestra a little bit, is sort of like what you're saying, right?
Yeah.
But it does sound very open. It does sound like you're sitting in a very small concert hall or a very large living room.
Yeah. Juan DeMarcos Gonzalez said that the album feels like you have a bunch of old guys in your house drinking rum and smoking cigars and playing a live show just for you. And I think that nails it. Like, it really does sound like they're just putting on a performance. They don't sound pressured either. Like, there's a looseness to it that I think is like really great. And I think a part of that is the approach that they were taking. None of these guys were like, if this album doesn't hit, I'm not going to make it. I'm like, I'm 70 fucking years old. I already didn't make it. I don't care.
And I think there's a good argument for hat tip to Ry Cooder there for creating that environment, right? And that is a really good environment to create as a producer. I mean, I think that's somewhat Rick Rubin's general approach to production.
Yeah, his is like just let them be them type of thing. Yeah. And I think that he was sort of just like, whatever direction you guys want to take this in is cool with me. We're going to have a good time. So they record the album and they really love the final product. Like they've said they would listen to like the playbacks of the songs and be like, this sounds fucking great. Like, honestly, this sounds really good. We did a great job of capturing what we wanted to capture, but like, will anybody really care? And Nick Gold really believes in it and he's excited to release it. The old Cuban abuelos are just like, it was a fun time, but none of them were like, my life from this point on is never going to be the same. They were kind of just like, I had a really great time recording an album. And, I think it sounds really good and I'm proud of it.
It must be really cool to like have I'll get the compact disc, hopefully.
But wait, when they're recording it, do they also have a camera crew?
Yeah, they had a guy who came and recorded with them. He was a Dutch guy, I think. Because part of that project was originally going to be the blending of cultures of the Cuban and the African musicians, and they kind of wanted to capture that. And they were sort of kind of, making lemonade out of what they were dealt. And so they also did have a guy who was coming along to record the project. But the project that they ended up recording was not what they thought it was going to be. They thought it was going to be this blending of cultures, and it turned out to be like a celebration of Cuban culture, You're
talking about Wim Wenders, right? That's the guy?
Yes.
Yeah, because I think, he made a few movies. I remember his movie Paris, Texas. Did you guys ever watch that?
I definitely remember that title.
Ry Cooder's involved with that as well.
I think he met Ry Cooder on that movie because Ry Cooder did the soundtrack or something.
Yeah. So like they had an idea of something that they wanted to do. Turned into something a little bit different, but they were really pleased with the results. And so Nick Gold is like, all right, let's fucking put this out in the world. It gets kind of released with as much fanfare as a world album in 1997 is going to get released with. It wasn't like an instantaneous hit, but it sort of soon started taking on a life of its own. This is one of those albums that they really describe as like a word of mouth type of success, where World Circuit, a really dumb name for his fucking his production company, had put together, as much promotional material as they could, and they did a good job of promoting it. But what really made this take off was people being like, have you heard this shit? This shit is pretty great. You should totally listen to this. And I feel like that's totally how I heard it. So I like, somebody was just like, this is a pretty good album. You should listen to it. And I was like, this is actually pretty damn great.
And did this kick off a little bit of a world music or Latin music craze? Did it help people get into more of this stuff? Or I'm trying to somewhat relate
You're thinking of Ricky Martin, I believe.
Oh, right, him.
Yeah, but you even got to wonder about like a band like Vampire Weekend, right? Who not too long, 4 or 5 years after this, would have been picking up on like a sort of Afro-Cuban indie pop sort of thing. Like you just wonder how much it contributed to an awareness.
I think they definitely drew from the massive success of Graceland. That would have been 10 plus years before. But then I was thinking about how David Byrne had that record label where he was promoting a lot of Brazilian artists and African artists. And I think that was around in the 90s.
I kind of remember that, yeah.
Yeah, everybody wanted to show how down they were with the different cultures. But frankly, and we've talked about this many times before, that American culture has been slowly consuming and also being changed by Latin culture for a long time now, for probably the last like 40, 50 years, where it's really started to have an influence on American culture generally. And we talked about it with food a lot, but I also think that there has been a Latin music influence that has dipped into a lot of American music.
I think it would take a very curious listener to hear something like this, and then, just like you would listen to Graceland and be like, oh, I'm going to listen to some African music.
Well, that's the challenge of these lists, because on the one hand, I think the 1001 list exists for records kind of like this, to get us out of our own headspace and say, listen to this stuff that's not what you might normally listen to because it's important culturally or otherwise. But at the same time, I feel like we need the story to go with it that Tom is telling to get any sense of the context of why it might be important.
Yeah. And one of the other things that I think is kind of important for the popularity of this album is the way that it looks. I feel like the album cover, they like really kind of nail the feel of the album with the album cover. It's got a little bit of mystery. It's got a little bit of not rundownness to it, but a little bit of almost like rugged mystery to it. I just think it looks really great.
It's got an element of Instagram filters years before Instagram.
Yeah, totally.
Sure. Yeah. Well, there's a reason why, that's a thing.
I want to say also, like the documentary wasn't. I think it was like picked up by PBS, or I just remember like seeing it. Like it was on TV. I remember like I have this memory of watching it with my parents. Maybe
That makes sense. Like you would have seen it on like public access, like PBS, WHYY. Yeah, obviously these call letters mean nothing to the rest of the world.
I didn't watch the documentary, but there's one documentary about them playing at Carnegie Hall or something, right?
That's the big documentary that came out in '99, which uses a lot of the footage from the studio. Like it uses.
I see.
It talks about the Carnegie Hall performance, and it talks about the making of the record as a bit of a retrospective, like a recent retrospective.
Yeah. And, frankly, I think that it was incredibly smart of them to put a visual element to this music, because if we're being honest, if you told me that these guys were a bunch of like 32-year-old guys from Cuba, it would be less cool.
Or Brooklyn.
There's just something cool about it, but like a bunch of like grandpas just out there fucking doing their thing.
Yeah, the story definitely enhances it for sure, and the visual. Yeah.
And Marty, to your point earlier, this is like PBS, NPR catnip. It's exactly what the kind of people that are not only producing those programs, but watching those programs exactly want to like.
You know what it just made me think of what you said? Remember that band Beirut that kind of had this Eastern European orchestra?
Totally. Yeah.
But it is just 25-year-olds from Brooklyn or something, right?
Totally.
All right. So by the time you get to 1998, this album is selling pretty well, and they win the Grammy for Best Traditional Tropical Latin Album, which, how goddamn specific do the Grammys get?
Yeah, who else was in that category?
Seriously. It's like they invented the category just to give them a win.
Yeah, they created a category.
Right, Cooter slid him $50,000 and was like, all right, yeah.
It's like William Shatner won a Grammy for whatever he does. It's like best former Star Trek actor, vocal performance with.
But they win a Grammy, and they're like, dude, like the world wants more. And I don't get the sense that for these guys, it was like, let's go out and make all the money that we can and strike while the iron is hot. I get the sense that they were like, we get to go out and play in front of a bunch of adoring fans. This sounds goddamned amazing. And so they're all like, fuck yeah. They pack them up. They tour them all over Europe and the U.S. Yes, there's many issues with getting into countries because of the Cuban passport thing. But frankly, at this point, they're celebrities and they have different rules than normal people do. And so I was just trying to picture in my head what that tour was like. You have like 20 mid-50s to mid-80s old Cuban guys touring.
Getting on an airplane, they're like, we're gonna need 9 wheelchairs, and like, oh, we only have 4 available.
Yeah, seriously.
What do you mean I can't smoke on this plane?
Well, and a lot of these dudes have been living really normal lives for the last like 40 years. They've just been, like you said, Ibrahim Ferrar was shining shoes and shit, you know?
Right.
And then all of a sudden they're the toast of the town, getting flown all over Europe, all over the US, adoring audiences. Most of them have never left Cuba in their life, you know? It's kind of crazy to think that this is the experience that they get. They go to the United States and their experience is fawning, adoring crowds.
Like I said, I watched some of the Charlie Rose interview with Ry Cooder about this, and Ry Cooder was talking about how some of the guys in the band didn't when they came to New York, they didn't recognize Marilyn Monroe and pictures of U.S. presidents from the 70s. They were just like,
this
who's
is
that guy?
JFK. He helped to ruin your economy.
Well, they were literally like, that's Richard Nixon. And they were like, oh, yeah, I've heard the name Richard Nixon. Okay, cool. That's Richard Nixon.
That seems weird to you, but it's not that
Yeah, of
weird.
course.
Yeah.
I recognize the Cuban presidents from that era. Singular.
Yes. Well, yeah, especially considering what an impact those particular presidents had on Cuba and the fortunes of kind of them specifically. I think they would have been burning them in effigy. Apparently, I think it was Juan de Marcos Gonzalez's wife had to act as like the nurse for a bunch of the guys. And so she would be going around at the end of the day being like, you got to take all of your pills. And these guys.
Yeah, when you brought this up, I definitely thought that like the drug handler is definitely a very different gig.
Exactly. Yeah. So this culminates in them playing Carnegie Hall, and they fucking kill it. Sold out house to see these old dudes rock out. This eventually becomes a live album that they recorded in 1998. It's not released for like 10 more years, which again, why did you not release it for 10 more years? Take advantage while you can of the phenomenon. But the thing that I took away from the story is that this is just such like a sweet last hurrah for all these guys. It really like genuinely helped my soul to repair some of the psychic damage that I've been inflicting upon it for the last 40 plus years of my life. Like, I was like, this just seems so great. And also, again, it held out hope for me that maybe someday somebody will be like, Tom, in my late 70s, come on, we need you. We need you to ride one more time, Grandpa. Like, if you wrote a movie script about this, it would be unbelievable. You'd be like, that's never gonna fucking happen.
Yeah, that's fair.
But it only is believable because it happened. Like, if you were to tell me that this movie starred like Tim Allen and like, a bunch of like,
Is that an Old Hogs reference?
yeah, it is actually.
Or Wild Hogs?
Wild
maybe?
Hogs. Yeah. You'd be like, that's fucking bullshit. There's no way. But I think that that's a huge part of the charm of this album. Now, let's dive into some individual songs. Shall we, gentlemen?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, the first song that we are going to get into on our focus list is, again, that opening track we will be revisiting, Chan Chan.
De Alto Cero voy para Martané, llego a Puerto voy para Mayarí.
I mean, just a great start to the album.
Yeah, exactly. Like, the only way this album could start, and just kind of the last thing we were kind of talking about is feeling like you're in the room. And something about the production of this song makes you feel like you're sitting with a bunch of old guys smoking cigars and drinking rum.
Totally. Very live band energy. And yeah, I'll give a concrete example for the listeners. The trumpet, when it comes in, feels kind of far away, but far away in a way that makes sense to your ear as if you were in the room listening to it.
Yeah.
Yep.
It just has a realness to it. And that is, yeah, that's some condition of both mic placement and mixing, like we're talking about. If it's recorded, people just kind of standing around in a room, but
Your head's in the room and everyone is spaced out in the exact right kind of way.
Well, yeah, like the three-dimensionality of the space, especially even with like the vocals, it's like sounds super natural. It doesn't sound like this guy's in the left and this guy's up the middle and this percussion's over here. It's very yeah, it sounds great.
And it's dark, like Thomas said. You listen to this album at night, it's kind of got a
It's like mysterious.
mysterious and dark, and the harmonies are effortless, and and really stand out to me.
The fact that they got Eliadis Ochoa, who is the lead singer, and I think he's that kind of higher voice in the mix, like the higher timbre voice in the mix. But there's two other guys that are singing, and they blend and sit so perfectly together that nobody's running over each other. You know who the lead is, but those other two voices are just exactly where they need to be.
No, there's one voice that sings like almost a pedal tone, like it really doesn't change much. But it's not very loud. There were times when I was listening to it, I was like, is that even there? And I was like, nah, there's somebody singing there.
Yeah. You're not hallucinating the perfect harmony.
No, yeah, it's real. It's below everything. It's subtle and it's awesome.
Yeah. And back to the trumpet, that was Manuel Mirabal. And there are so many musicians on this album that we're just going to name check a couple of them as they come up in the songs. But the fact that you have to wait 2/3 of the way through this song for that trumpet to come in, and then it comes in, you're like, that is exactly what this song needed. It's so tasteful and it's so patient.
Such a cool solo, yeah.
They don't just blast that great little line at the beginning of the song where they could have done, because the chords don't change. It's the same chords the entire song. They could have chose to put any part in it at any time that they wanted, and the choices that they made were really, really tasteful.
Speaking of the chords not changing, it has that trance-like vibe, and they have that chanting element of the main vocal lines over top of it. And just to speak intelligently, maybe the only time today, about the rhythmic things going on, because there's so many different like rhythmic details happening on these. So I got excited when I actually knew one. This rhythmic idea is called the Charleston, right? It's how the chords are landing, and it's basically they're hitting on the one and the two and.
I thought it was the Lindy Hop, personally.
Does the rhythm dictate the dance, or does the dance dictate the rhythm?
It's a good question, because this is a danceable song. This seems like...
Is a foxtrot a musical rhythm, or is it a dance?
I know that Charleston started as a song.
As a song,
and
okay.
then became a dance, and then became a general terminology, at least in the Western tradition, for this exact rhythm. 1, 2, 3, bop, 2, 3. It feels like it's always kind of jumping ahead an eighth note, and it's hitting on that and beat and letting it sit.
Wow.
Yeah. Very much like the Percolator, a song that then sparked a dance craze.
Yeah. Or the electric slide.
Finally, we connect these dots.
The electric slide is my favorite chord progression.
That's definitely the electric slide is definitely a musical genre.
100 years from now, some assholes in a podcast can be like, well, that's actually the electric slide. That's what that rhythm is called.
I think we need to do a whole episode about the electric slide. Did that exist on the radio outside of weddings? Is that a real thing?
Oh man, I don't know. This has a great Ry Cooder moment on this song, and I think you sense his influence on this record. At 140, he plays a sweet slide guitar lick.
Totally. That is totally in my notes. I love
He
that.
goes, wah. That's all he does, and it's great.
Yeah.
Y el jibe a Chan Chan le daba pena.
And the percussion is just so sick. There's like a talking drum that you hear like maybe once. It's like boom, or maybe it's like
I agree. Yeah, so chill.
Yeah. And like, it's chill, but it's also very danceable. Like this is kind of like baby making music, you know? Like
It's very sexy.
You're in a club dancing with a woman to this, and everybody's getting lucky tonight. And this has an energy to it. It's like crackling with this vibe that is just, I don't know, it's infectious, I have to say.
Yeah, I imagine when they were recording this, everyone was kind of in agreement that like, okay, this is the vibe, this is the song, this is what we're gonna base everything off of.
Yeah, they're like, this has to be the opening, and I think that they're also like, we have to play this every time we play live. This has to be included, first or last, you know.
For sure.
Let's go on to the next song on our focus list, De Camino a la Verada. I think this song is fucking also super infectious. This is the song I kept humming.
So fun.
Like, yeah.
Totally. This has like a beach vibe, island vibe to it.
More calypso to it.
Harry Belafonte, yeah, give Major Harry Belafonte vibes.
Did you guys look at the translated lyrics for this song? They're kind of weird.
No, I did look at them, but I also read an interpretation of them.
Oh, okay. Let's hear
He's
that.
saying something like, don't leave the way to take the path.
Right.
Which is a little confusing at its face, but I read that it's about a friend telling his buddy not to stray from his wife with another woman.
Okay, that's what I gathered.
And yet, it's like those old soul singers that were singing about how much they love their wife and they were like stepping out all the time. Not that I'm accusing these guys of infidelity, but like, it's got to be pretty tough when you're performing this kind of sexy music in the club afterwards. I got to imagine every woman in the place is coming
When
up.
you're shining shoes by day and
Yeah, right.
in the club at night.
Yeah.
And also, it has like the classic ice cream.
Yes. What about the bird call right at the beginning?
Oh, no. I was thinking that there was a commercial. I think it was maybe a Friendly's commercial or a Baskin Robbins commercial that was like, ice cream. And that's part of this song.
Deep down the cultural appropriation path there, Marty.
So who's singing lead on this one?
This is Ibrahim Ferrer.
So this is Ferrer.
Yeah, this is the very old guy who was brought in just by chance to sing
Dos Gardenias.
Dos Gardenias, and they were like, yeah, that works. You should just stick around.
Just hang out, dude.
And this dude went on to have a hell of a career. Didn't he release like some solo records?
Oh, yeah.
He's on a Gorillaz track, I believe.
Oh, I didn't know that, but hell yeah, good for him. And he wrote this song too. So this is an Ibrahim Ferrer song. He had recorded a version of this in like 85 or something like that. And nobody gave a shit. He recorded a version of it in 1985, and it was just kind of like, okay, cool, Grandpa, whatever. I'm glad you're still doing stuff.
He died of multiple organ failure after returning from European tour.
Hell yeah, man. Multiple organ failure. That's the way to go. This bullshit kidney failure. He got them all.
His body was like, I am out.
Yeah. But seriously, good run. Good run, you know.
I also like at the end of this track, somebody calls out El Final right at the end,
Yes.
tag it.
Yeah. I didn't have to get the translation on that one. I could figure that one out myself. So I think Ibrahim does a fantastic job singing on this. It also sounds like everybody in the band is doing the response part, which is also great. But there is this one part, and it's at 158. And he hits this note. And the first time I heard it, I was like, good try, Grandpa. That note didn't work. And then I swear to God, it became like my favorite part of maybe the entire album. He hits this note that just sounds wrong.
Pero mira, compadrito, te ha botado a la pobre Geraldina para meterte con Dorotea.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
And it's like this weird note. You're like, oh, that doesn't sound right. And then you're like, oh no, that's actually perfect. It's so good.
I definitely hear it like listening to the clip now. It is a cool kind of like out note. But to your point, there's nothing wrong with it. It's just unexpected. And he holds it. Right.
Yeah, it's a jazzy interval of some sort.
Exactly. There's a Miles Davis song where it plays a note that I always thought like always made me feel really uncomfortable. And the more I've listened to it, the more I'm like, oh, it's
totally fine. Yeah.
purposefully executed. Yeah, and fine. Yeah.
And just one more thing on the percussion, because I think the percussion on this album is top notch. It sounds like at one point there's a guy just like hitting a bottle with a drumstick, and I couldn't find any specific percussion instrument that was listed that could have done that. And I think it literally was a guy hitting a rum bottle with a drumstick, which is pretty fucking awesome. All right, we're going to go on to the next song on our focus list. It is the song Dos Gardenias.
Dos gardenias para ti, con ella quiero decir, te quiero, te adoro, mi vida. Ponle todas tu atención, que serán tu corazón y el mío. Dos gardenias para ti, que tendrán todo el calor de un beso, de esos besos que te di y que jamás te encontrarán.
I want to call out the piano player here.
Oh, yeah.
I think he's doing an excellent minimalist jazzy job pushing the song forward. There's some crunk notes in there. He kind of only plays transitions a lot of times. He kind of like stabs at it. It's really interesting and cool playing.
That is Ruben Gonzalez, the guy who was just aching to have a piano at his fingertips and finally got the opportunity and really took advantage of it. He actually ended up, the song Buena Vista Social Club that we're not going to talk about, they had not intended to include it on the album, and it was just the bass player's dad had written this chord pattern, and Ruben Gonzalez just thought it was cool, and he was just kind of improvising on it during, because it sounds like he never stopped playing. And so at one point, Ry Cooder was just like, what is that? And he's like, it's this cool song here. He's like, oh, what is it? He's like, Buena Vista Social Club. That's what we're going to call it. And he was like, that's not only, first of all, fucking fantastic. Second of all, that's the name of this project, which I thought was really cool, because he was like, that's the place that I used to play at when I was young. You know, I used to be, they had a piano there. I could go there and play. And I thought that was like a really cool addition to the story. That just like everything sounded so loose and so free.
I think it's a great anecdote, because I would have flagged that track specifically as like sort of the keyboard player's time to shine on the record. And he really is just great on this song and on this record in general. He really is just fantastic.
But back to Dos Gardenias, not knowing much, to be fair, this one almost reminds me of a tango.
Yeah.
It has that like push and pull. When I listen to tango music, rare as that may be, I always feel like I'm not 100% sure where the beat is. And I'm always reminded of people dancing to it and kind of moving in rhythm with each other. So that's what this gave me. But and ultimately, it is a very minimalist, I think, kind of music.
Exactly. This tune stands out as having less than 20 people performing on it. It sounds like maybe there's 3 or 4 people performing. Less percussion going on, more piano driven, like you mentioned, Rob.
There is, I believe, an udu drum being played by Joaquin Cooder on that. And that's kind of like boom, boom, boom sound that's on there. You hear it like right at the beginning.
Yeah, it's in there.
But this song was written by a woman named Isolina Carrillo back in like 1945. And I found it a little bit interesting that she was alive when this album was being recorded. Was not included in the project. But like she was alive and she was still playing. That is true for a couple of other people. Granted, she also was probably like 85 years old. And so, and she's born in like 1911.
I mean, she might have just turned him down, right? That's a possibility.
Right. I'm sure there's plenty of people that were like, no, I can't travel.
Are you kidding me? I got shoes to shine here. They didn't have to travel. They all lived in Havana.
Still though.
Yeah, they were like, hey, do you want to come down to the studio and sing? And she was like, Nah.
When you're 85, going across town is traveling, Marty.
That's a good point. Yeah.
There's a new Golden Girls on tonight. There's a new Wheel of Fortune.
She's like, I have not gotten out of this rocking chair in the last 7 years, and I'm not going to start today. But I just think that the trumpet work on this particularly is fantastic. And it is great that you get a trumpet without the whole horn ensemble coming at you and lets the trumpet shine a whole lot. That opening trumpet line, I think, is just fantastic. Sets the mood of the song.
Yeah, I thought this one was really cool. I noticed, I'll call it a timestamp of 2:25 when he sings Dos Gardenias de mi amor or Las Gardenias de mi amor, and he kind of wavers and finds the notes.
Las gardenias de mi amor se mueren. Es porque
I read this breakdown recently. I don't know if this is fully applicable or not, but I read that one thing that really typifies the difference between Western music tradition and so-called non-Western music is that in Western music, the melodic notes are seen as a little more of a bullseye to be hit direct on. And that's in part because our harmonic construction is very vertical in its thinking. Like we stack notes vertically in the Western tradition to achieve a certain emotional quality or something. And in Eastern music, the melody is the thing, and the underlying chords tend to be a lot lighter, and rhythm is more what's driving it. And thus, there's a lot more potentiality to embellish melodies. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is this vocal performance, I really liked it. It almost reminded me of some farther Eastern music, like Arabic music or Indian music. It felt like he was really quavering around the notes.
Yeah, it feels definitely emotional, but having to chase that note, it feels like the cowboy poet or like the Tex-Mex crying for your love, sing your heart out type of feel that I liked about this song.
Well, and credit to Ry Cooder, again, because they had somebody else, I think it might have been Eliadis Ochoa, who was singing originally, and they're like, you're too powerful and confident, and we need it delicate. And that's how they came to Ibrahim Ferrer. And first of all, changed his goddamn life for the better, but also the absolute right call, because I do think that this is a standout vocal performance on the album. It's got that fragility to it that really makes you feel the subject matter, even though I can't understand 80% of the lyrics, I still feel it, you know?
Yeah, isn't that weird how like you can listen to an album like this and listen to it in its entirety, but for me anyway, if I listen to like an album in German, like a Can album, sometimes I can be kind of turned off by it, even though it's more familiar style of music, like rock or prog or whatever.
Sure.
But this one kind of cuts. You don't need to really know exactly what they're saying because it comes across.
It's almost more beautiful because you don't fully understand the story. It allows your imagination to fill in gaps differently.
But there are languages that are more pleasing to the ear than other languages. German is a harsh language.
Right.
And so you're not exactly like, oh, that German love song, you know?
Sure.
All right, let's go on to the next song on our focus list. It is Candela.
This has kind of that 2/4 pushing rhythmic feel, kind of offbeat. Harken me back to like kind of Tito Puente.
Yeah,
Sure.
definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely has a mambo-ish vibe,
yeah.
like some of the Tito Puente stuff. I noticed that the writer of this song has the nickname of El Guayabero, which translates to the deceitful liar.
That's pretty awesome. Yeah, this is one of those ones that I feel like it kept me on my toes because the background vocals kind of came in on a beat that I wasn't expecting. And even when I knew the song, I still was caught off guard when the background vocals would choose to come in and the beat that they would come in on.
Even when they're singing that main line of Candela, they're changing where the emphasis points are.
Yeah.
So somewhat continually, and that's part of what you're talking about of keeping you on your toes. It doesn't just feel like it's repeating.
Totally. Big shout out to the percussion on this song. The percussion on the song fucking rips.
Awesome.
It's really good. And like you said, there's no traditional drum set that they're playing with, but it really moves. And
Totally. It crushes. Well, yeah, it has a drumline vibe without having not like a marching band drumline, but some kind of drum. It has a drumline vibe, and it's awesome.
It's very structured, and yeah, you're right. Like it's like a drum circle vibe where like everyone's just given one. Everyone's given one thing to play, and it's like, okay, make this into something.
yeah.
And I think the acoustic guitar gets a nice little spotlight around 225. Yeah, it's a cool little solo.
I believe that's Ry Cooder actually stepping out on the guitar on this one.
Oh, nice.
This is the one that I felt like it's the second longest song on the album. And the first several times I listened to it, I was like, it's a little long. But I got to tell you, I got hypnotized by that end with that call and response. They just have that response that keeps coming in continuously, and it gets to this kind of drone feel to it and lets the main vocals go over the top. And I was really like entranced by the end of the song. And then again, try to put myself in the mindset of like a darkly lit room on a beautiful summer night dancing with a bunch of strangers to this song. And I was just like, that sounds fucking amazing. I really could totally get down to that.
Right, because the lyrics are all like, I'm on fire, I'm on fire, I'm on fire, I'm fire, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, it seems to be about animals dancing in the nighttime by candlelight and then accidentally starting a fire that burns the house down.
Yeah. It's an allegory for fucking, Rob, of course.
I've always loved that firefighter in Spanish is bombero.
Yeah.
You just love that in general.
Yeah, it's just great. It's just fun.
All right, let's go on to the last song on our focus list. It is the song, and I'm probably going to butcher the pronunciation of this one because for whatever reason, I keep having problems actually getting this one correct. Orgullo Sitida.
Divina y de tener tan linda perfección. Tal vez será que soy a la madrina, serán los filtros reinos del amor.
This song's kind of different from the rest. What I wrote down is Cuban Take Me Out to the Ball Game.
Totally. It was 100% my low light, in case that was not obvious.
It's way dorkier. That's funny because I wrote that it was the Cuban The Entertainer.
Oh, yeah.
I have Cuban Randy Newman.
Nice. Yeah, I said that this kind of gets a little bit into luau territory, especially with that guitar solo. It's a little like...
Sure.
Too derivative, and the trumpet solo is all like ragtime and everything. Like, this didn't feel like they were incorporating other styles of music into their music. It felt like they were trying to turn their music into another style of music, and I don't think it was very successful.
Maybe like a New Orleans style or something.
It had a little bit of 1930s Louis Armstrong, but it also had, I think you're saying, this kind of silent film era cowboy music to it.
Yeah, it just wasn't successful, and frankly, it was just cheesy. And I think a big part of what I dislike is that they got away from that swinging clave rhythm, and they got into like oompa polka rhythm, basically. It's that kind of like, it felt like the rhythm was a lot more the Mexican corridor songs, the oompa, oompa, oompa. And I was like, that's not where this music thrives the most. This music thrives the most with a little bit of hip swinging, and not, there's a reason why polka is German music, because Germans can't dance. And so it got away from what their successful formula was.
I do wonder if there's like more of a West African influence in Cuban music than I understand, or maybe any of us understand. Because this song definitely has way more of the Mexican German vibe, right? As opposed to not everything else, but the 4 other songs we listen to definitely dive into that. What did you call it? Like Son Soul?
Son Cubano.
Son Cubano, yeah. And the bolero sort of sounds and rhythms.
Mm-hmm.
Just a lot sexier. This one's just it's a little goofy and like overly playful. I kind of like the guitar intro, but it's a little cheesy.
Well, all right. We have come to the time that everyone on the podcast looks forward to, is when we vote and tell you, do you really need to hear this album before you die? I am going to throw it around the room to get those votes etched permanently, Phil, no going back, into the sacred scroll. And I am actually going to throw it first to Marty. Marty, what say you, good sir?
Yeah, we talked in the beginning about how we're going to talk shit on this album and not much shit was talked.
Yeah, it's a good point.
And there's a reason for that. Is because this is a pretty good album. And so, yeah, I think it belongs on the list. It's easy for me to say yes.
Great. Phil, what do you say?
Yeah, I agree with Marty. This is an easy listen. It's wonderful music. Like we said, it's kind of wonderful nighttime, evening in your home music. And it's definitely a gateway to other musics you might be into that aren't, sort of mainstream Western music. So, it's an easy yes for me.
All right, Rob, what say you, good sir?
Yeah, I'll continue this tradition. It is also an easy yes for me. And let me be clear, I have no idea if this is a great representation of Cuban Son music, but it is a great compilation. It is internally consistent. It's a vibe. And that's more what I'm judging it on. It's fun to listen to, it's enjoyable, and hopefully it's an entry point for your ears to something you don't normally get to hear. So in a way, that's what these lists are for.
Awesome. And my vote is moot at this point, but I'm going to say, fuck those old Cubans. You don't need... No, I'm just kidding. This album is great.
I was like, again, Tom?
No, it's a feel-good story. It's a feel-good album. Is it samey? Sure, it's samey, but I don't get more of this in my daily listens. And so it feels like a departure, even though the entire album kind of sounds the same. It's fun, and you should absolutely listen to it, and then hopefully come to an appreciation of not necessarily where this album influenced Western music or American music or even UK music, but where the roots of this album had an influence on some of the other musical styles that you have come to know and appreciate. So, easy yes. Congratulations, Buena Vista Social Club. I would absolutely love to have some rum and cigars with you guys. If you ever hear this, please hit me up.
Those of you that are still alive.
Those of you that are still alive. If you want to have one last hurrah coming out to California, I'll show you the town. Take you salsa dancing or something like that. Anyway, you are on the list with a unanimous 4 out of 4 vote. Ooh. Way to go, guys. As if there was ever any doubt when we first heard of this album through the Albinator and knew that this is what we're going to do this week. I knew this was going to be a 4 out of 4 vote. None of us are that big curmudgeons, with the exception of maybe me, and I already knew I was going to vote yes. Just a few things that we have to do before we round out this podcast. Before we get our homework assignment for next week, I am going to throw it on over to Rob, and he is going to dip his hand into that mailbag and pull us out a message in a bottle.
Thank you, Tom, my brother. Pulling my hand out right now. And interestingly, because this country came up earlier in the show, so I think we know who to ask our question to. Philippe from Belgium writes, "Hey, fellas, I've been regularly enjoying your banter for about a year now. You were saying the mail was getting better all the time, so I thought I'd write in and tank that trend. Always fun and informative, including bonus insights as a European into U.S. culture, like interstate sensitivities and being made aware of the existence of Delaware. Of course, I don't always agree with the final verdict, but usually there's one of you close enough to my opinion to elicit my grunt of approval. I listen on my commute mostly, but occasionally I do it while chopping wood in the garden.
Wow.
The highly entertaining Motorhead episode and Life of Brian / Marilyn Manson episode served me well for that. Anyway, enough said. I learned a lot. I laughed a lot. So keep up the good work. Many sincere thanks.
Excellent.
Chopping wood material, guys.
Chopping wood in the garden.
Yeah.
That means sex.
I got one more here. And Tony writes in, hey, fellas, love the show, particularly the history leading up to the album and the musical details you as musicians are able to convey. I'm a couple weeks behind, typically, but have listened to every episode. I most often agree with Rob.
Oh.
I most often disagree with Adam.
Okay.
Phil is my favorite character.
Oh, Phil.
I'm glad I'm a character. I'd like to confirm I am a character, by the way. I'm not.
That's right. Yes, Phil is getting his own spin-off show soon, like Laverne and Shirley. So you mentioned Jim Morrison's father, Rear Admiral Morrison, during the Doors episode. So I thought I'd add some additional potentially apocryphal context. I was born in Guam back in 1973 because my father was in the Navy. He broke his leg during boot camp around 1970, so they asked him what value he could add given the injury. And since my family had owned a bar and grill for 50 years, my father said, hey, I can bartend. Hence, my father became the bartender at the Officers Club in Guam for his Vietnam War tour of duty, a pretty sweet gig. So get this, the Officers Club doesn't close until the last officer leaves every night, regardless of time. And more often than not, that last officer was the Rear Admiral Morrison.
So Jim Morrison's drinking problem came out of nowhere.
Big Scotch guy, the Rear Admiral. My father and him got very close, often talking about the estranged relationship between him and his son, Jim. My father was there the day Jim died, July 3rd, 1971, and they talked deep into the night. My father left Guam in the service in late 1974, and as he was about to board the transport plane for the long flight home, the Rear Admiral came out to see him off, offering him a hug and salute, something he never did for any other enlisted man, being the rank and importance that he was. As my father may have been the most non-compliant sailor in the history of the Navy, it spoke to the bond they seemed to forge as humans in that place and time. Anyway, there you have it.
That is fucking awesome.
Yeah, that's sick. I feel like we're
That's good mail.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's great mail.
Yeah.
We love those kinds of personal
It's
anecdotes.
insane, yeah.
That's really cool. Keep
awesome,
sending them over. Send all your thoughts our way to 1001albumcomplaints at gmail.com.
Yes. Thank you to everyone who wrote in, and thank you to everyone who has listened all the way through to the end of this podcast where we get our homework assignment. Very excited. I'm going to try to stop the Albinator from mamboing with all the young ladies in the corner. I'm going to pull it on over here and see if we can get it to spit out another album. So, without any further ado, drum roll please, we will be listening to the album is Time, parentheses, The Revelator, and the artist is Gillian Welch.
I know Gillian Welch, but I'm not familiar with his record. No.
Yeah, I know her name. She's in the country milieu somehow.
Yeah, I would have assumed that she was British, but apparently not. All right, country. Here we go.
That might be unfair. I think she's probably thought of as a modern songwriter.
I know one song on this album that I like a lot.
Okay, there we go. All right, fantastic. Listen to Time, The Revelator by Gillian Welch. Gillian?
I guess you'll figure it out when you do your research.
I guess I'll figure it out. God damn. All right. Just want to thank you all for tuning in. We really do appreciate that you spend your time with us every week listening to us gab on about these fantastic albums. We really do love doing it, and we love that you love listening in. So for everyone here at 1001 Album Complaints, I have been Tom.
I'm Marty.
I'm Phil.
And I'm Rob.
A boosh.